Hi, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be constructing our own framework for field recording. Let's head over to my screen and we'll have a quick recap on what field recording frameworks are. You might remember in previous videos I've talked about Bernie Krause, Chris Watson and R. Murray Schafer. Now, these are quite famous field recordists and they all have a different framework for working with. So if we're going to make our own framework, it's handy to know what they are. Let's go to the next slide. So this is Bernie Krause's framework. I do have a previous video on that, so if you want more detail, go to that. But basically, Bernie thinks about it as elements within a soundscape. So you have the whole soundscape, and within that you'll have earth sounds, which is rock, water, wind, etc. And you also have biological sounds, animals, birds. And then you have man-made sounds. So speech, sound of our bodies, and the machines that humans make. One, two, or all of these can be contained in a soundscape. Then we went to Chris Watson's, and that's more about the quality of the sound. Is it ambient? Is it incidental? Or is it isolated? Up till now I have found this better for analysing recordings rather than using it out in the field itself. Now let's move on to the next one. This is Murray Schafer's. Now this is more specialised. This was developed to identify sounds within a certain place in Canada. If you want to find out more about that, search out R. Murray Schafer and the Sound Project. So this was conducted in an area of Canada, and what they did was they wanted to find the keynote of the place, which is the ambience, but they narrowed it down to geophonic sound, sound of the earth, and the sound of biological organisms within that place. Then they had intermittent sounds, which in their project were specifically human-made sounds. And then within that area, there were particular sounds that were common to that area. Say aircraft at an airport, trains, species of bird, you name it. It was a sound mark of the place. Let's move on to the next slide. As you can see, these frameworks are all quite different. And each of these recordists have stated that these are guidelines only. They're what they use. They're not rules for recording, which means you can develop and adapt any type of framework for your type of recording. And you can develop specific ones for specific projects. The good thing about these frameworks is that by knowing them, it gives us an idea of what frameworks are. So Schafer's was a framework that was trying to capture a sense of place. Krause's was more about categories of sound within a soundscape. And Watson's is more about the features of the sounds themselves. Now we all live in different places in the world. We have our own view of the world. We have our own interests. So particular features of frameworks would differ for all of us. But as we practice our recordings, we soon realise that we can start creating our own frameworks, which is what I've realised. In my own recordings, I've realised there are other things to think about. So I've only been doing this for about 6 months, and already I've realised that there's a seasonal variation to recordings. Sound changes in hot weather and cold weather. The sounds of wildlife changes. For instance, if you go out at the moment, which for me is autumn, you don't get a dawn chorus, because the dawn chorus seems to start just before the breeding season, which is in February, and finishes in midsummer to autumn. Yeah, you will hear birds singing. It's not the same as in the breeding season. And we've got to think birds migrate. Another thing to think about is human activity. So in the summer where I live, it's really noisy. I live in a rural place, though we are a holiday destination. So in the summer, it's just totally full of people, noise, cars, you name it. It's a nightmare. And now in the autumn, the majority of those who've gone to human sounds have diminished. So in the holiday season, we get lots of people. In the winter, we get hardly anyone. And it changes the soundscape. But I've also noticed that the time of day can also have a really big effect, especially between day and night, the dusk till dawn period. Dusk and dawn is the best time to hear birdsong. And also dusk and dawn is when human activity begins, the daily grind, and then starts to slow down. And in the middle of the night, it's obviously quiet. Or is it? We'll find out later when we listen to some recordings. But I've also noticed that temperature has an effect on sound. Before we go into that, let's remember how sound travels. So basically, sound travels through the atmosphere by knocking molecules, atoms in the air. Remember, in a vacuum, there's no sound. There's nothing in a vacuum that can continue the transmission of sound. Now, if this is the case, where you need atoms knocking together, temperature will have a really big effect. I don't know whether you've noticed, but I've realised when the temperature is warm, the sound is more muddy. It's thick, but yet I've noticed that it's clear. It's really well defined. And there's a simple explanation for that, which is that atoms are more active and get more active when they get warmer and become more volatile. So when sound's going through, it spreads out much further. But when it's cold, atoms seem to stay relatively in their place, so one will knock the next to the next. And rather than disperse everywhere, tend to go in lines. That's just something that I've noticed, and I'm going to think about that a bit further as the year comes to an end and it gets cold. Another thing I've thought about, because I've had experiences where I've recorded silence. Now that's relative silence, because if you pull the recording up, no doubt you will find something. So it's relative silence to everyday sounds. But the other thing I've noticed is that when you have that silence and there is a sound within it, it defines the sound. And this is just something I'm pondering on, and I'll do more work on that in the future. So what we're going to do now is we're going to listen to 4 sections out of a 10-hour recording, and it starts at dusk and ends at dawn. So I've annotated these in my view of what these sounds represent. You may have a different view, but that's absolutely fine. And I'll see you on the other side, and we'll take that a step further. So from the annotations and the recordings, I'll give you now my interpretation of what these are in the Watson framework. So from audio clip 1, we had traffic and the breeze, which I put down as ambient, songbirds and the raven with the wing beats as incidental within the whole soundscape. So there's nothing isolated recognized in there at all. And the second one, we had traffic and breeze, and we've gone into nighttime and there's an owl hoot. So that's ambient and incidental. And to my mind, the owl sound is not isolated. But then in the early hours of the morning, where there's no traffic and no breeze, we have a relative silence. We could call it the sound of relative silence. And within that, we have an owl, and it's quite distinct. It is the only real audible sound. So I've identified that as isolated. The silence has allowed the owl to be clearly defined. It is totally isolated. Now I have other thoughts on isolated sound, but that's for another video because they're quite complicated. But from the recordings, we come to the morning, to the dawn, and what do we have? The birds start to sing, and there's traffic, and we can hear machinery in the background as the day starts to form. So the traffic is ambient, birdsong and machinery are both incidental. So just a quick recap there. Dawn, dusk. Is it warmer? Is it helping to make it noisier? Other than the sound of traffic and machinery, of course. And in the dead of night, that owl sound is so clear, above the relative sound of silence. Molecules in the air at that time of night are going to be relatively still to help the owl sound stand out and be clear and sharp, which is what it is. I go to the next slide. So the way I'm viewing this now is that if we take Watson's framework, lay it underneath, so we can recognize whether the sound is ambient, incidental, or isolated. And then on each of those corners of the triangle, we can put a Krause triangle, because the ambient sounds can be the breeze, which is geophonic, traffic, which is man-made, or it could be biophonic in another recording. But in our recordings, if we had ambient sound, we had geophonic and man-made sounds. So if we take Krause's model now onto the incidental sounds, we had man-made sounds, machinery, and bird sounds. So these were spattered over the ambient sound. And then we had one case of isolated sound, but the ambience was silence, and there was one sound, and it was quite clear. It was an owl hoot, so the whole recording, a whole section of that recording is silence and an owl hoot. In other words, you could say there's no ambient or incidental sound, there is only an isolated sound. There are other ways of looking at this, but we're not going to do them now. I'm still working on those. I'm moving this forward as my prototype for working with recordings and going out to do recordings. But when I'm going out to do recordings, I'm now also considering the time of the year, the time of day, and also the temperature. So I've learned a lot in the last 6 months about the recording devices and microphones, but I think this has been the most important, because now I'm developing a really good idea of what I'm recording. When I listen back to recordings, I can identify the different elements and I can categorize them, and I have a whole different appreciation of what sound is. So traffic to me now is not noise, it's ambient sound if it's in the background. And we can go on to discuss a lot of other things here, but that's for another video. So until those, I'd like to say thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.